So different microbes can live in the presence of oxygen and some can't. So typically we think of oxygen as a positive thing, but actually oxygen can be pretty toxic to microbes or even to humans. So there are some forms of what we call toxic oxygen or toxic oxygen species, which are written here. So superoxide anions and hydrogen peroxide. And these are sort of natural things that occur within a cell as a result of you using oxygen when you metabolize. So you need to have evolved or have these enzymes in order to make them not toxic. So if you are using oxygen, you're going to make superoxide anions, and therefore you need an enzyme called superoxide dismutase. Any name that has an ASE at the end, that is an enzyme. So it basically breaks that superoxide anion down and makes it not toxic. Many bacteria and humans also have catalase, which is an enzyme that breaks down hydrogen peroxide, which can be potentially harmful to cells, both microbes and humans. And so in order to use oxygen, you need to be able to have specialized enzymes to deal with sort of the negative effects that can arise. However, organisms do like to use oxygen because they're essential for aerobic metabolism, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture, because oxygen can be very helpful in terms of making a lot of ATP, which is an energy storage molecule. So organisms tend to live in different oxygen requirements, and these are the 5 that I am requiring you to know. So a microbe that needs oxygen to grow and survive is called an obligate aerobe. An organism that is a facultative anaerobe is one that prefers to live when oxygen is present, but has the ability to survive without oxygen. So it can create energy and metabolize when oxygen isn't there, but it does it more efficiently when oxygen is present. A microaerophile is one that grows at levels of oxygen that are lower than atmospheric. So there's like 21%, I think, roughly oxygen in the atmosphere. So they prefer to grow it where there is less oxygen than that, like 10% or 15% or something like that. Now, an obligate anaerobe means it's obligated to grow where there is no oxygen present at all. It cannot deal with toxic oxygen and therefore cannot tolerate free oxygen in its environment, and if it were exposed to oxygen, it would die. So it's obligated to live in an anaerobic or non-oxygen environment. An aerotolerant organism is one that doesn't need oxygen to survive or grow or metabolizes, but it can live in the presence of oxygen. So a way that we can test for what a bacteria's oxygen requirement is by growing it in media. So these tubes right here are examples. So this is an actual picture and this is an animation. We're going to talk about what these 5 mean in terms of the aerobic lifestyles that we just went over on the last slide. But here's what it looks like in the actual lab. So what you do is you fill a test tube full of nutrient agar. So this is that jelly-like stuff that we have in our plates, and you pierce the tube with the bacteria, and then you can visually see where they're growing. And so if we look at these 5 pictures, we can see that this organism right here in tube 1 is growing very close to the surface where it has access to oxygen. This is an obligate anaerobe, because you can see that it's not growing down here where there is no oxygen or less oxygen present. Tube 2, you can see there's the bacteria growing at the very bottom, as far away from the atmospheric like oxygen air that's present here where the tube is open. So that is something that cannot survive or cannot grow where there is oxygen present. In tube 3, you see a majority of the bacteria want to grow at the surface. So that's where there's a lot of oxygen, but there are some growing throughout the tube. This is a facultative anaerobe, one that prefers to grow where the oxygen is present, but can survive where it is not. Tube 4 shows a microaerophile, where a majority of the bacteria are growing lower in the tube, because essentially what happens is there becomes an oxygen gradient, where there's a lot of oxygen here and no oxygen down here, and sort of like a degree of oxygen in between. So majority of them are growing in the middle of the tube, where there's a lower percentage of oxygen than atmospheric. And then tube 5 is a tube in which you see that the bacteria are kind of growing throughout the tube no matter what. So they can live in the presence of oxygen. They have no particular oxygen requirement, and tube 5 represents something that is aerotolerant. Now I'm also going to talk in this video about pH requirements. So pH is your acidity, and a majority of organisms grow somewhere with a pH between 6 and 8. And this is kind of the pH of the body. It's also the pH of water is 7. So, you know, it makes sense that in like a water-based planet, the majority of environments that exist on the planet are somewhere between a pH of 6 and 8. Organisms that are considered obligate acidophiles, those are organisms that need to survive where it is an acidic environment. They are acid-loving organisms. And some examples of that are like Euglena. Euglena is an algae species that prefers to grow in a pH of 0 to 1. That's very low. That's like battery acid. It's something that will like burn through your skin. Thermoplasmas are also an example of archaea that like to grow at very low pHs, and they actually grow in very hot coal piles, which is why they're thermoplasma. So they like hot, very acidic environments. And actually, if you expose them to a pH of like water, they actually lyse and burst. They're unable to survive in neutral pHs. Now, organisms that are alkali-philes, alkaline is basic, so pH above 7, so those are high pH lovers. And, you know, if you think about this, if anybody is a canner, you know that when you can foods and you preserve foods, that you use things to lower the pH. So a lot of time you're putting like vinegar, which is an acid, into when you like pickle things and whatnot, you use vinegar because it lowers the pH and it prevents the growth of a lot of microbes. If you are going to can like tomatoes, tomatoes are slightly acidic, and a lot of times you don't even have to do anything when you're canning tomatoes in order to lower the pH. You can just sort of boil them, and the pH alone of the tomatoes prevents the growth of most bacterial species. So a lot of them have a degree of pH in which they prefer to live. In the next video, I'll start to talk about relationships between bacteria as they live in the environment.